The reality is, everyone, everywhere, stands to benefit from self-driving technology. More than that, when you consider the state of driving today, it's also clear that our roads need to be safer. It's sort of crazy. Worldwide, 1.25 million people die annually on our roadways.
That's the CEO of Waymo, John Krafcik, talking at the Web Summit in Lisbon in November about the potential impact of autonomous vehicles on improving our roads. Waymo, if you're not familiar, is Alphabet's self-driving car company. Previously, this project was run by Google before the company was restructured, and Waymo and Google before it have been the world leaders at building autonomous vehicles.
In the last 8 years, Waymo's vehicles have driven more than 5.5 million autonomous kilometers on public roads, and that's across more than 20 cities. It's about 140 times around the globe.
In a large amount of the testing that Waymo has been doing, a driver has been behind the wheel, making sure that the car doesn't do anything wrong, and if it does, they take over. However, in the more recent future, Waymo has been removing humans from the equation entirely. Humans make errors and aren't perfect. They also have a habit of trusting the technology. Autonomous vehicles are run by artificial intelligence, which, as we discussed back in episode 2, requires data, and a lot of it. These systems need to be trained, which is why it's so important that these vehicles clock up a lot of kilometers.
Right now, we're driving about 16,000 kilometers every day on public roads, and driving another 16 million kilometers each day in simulation.
And this vast amount of experience has resulted in some very reliable cars. But the truth is, roads are complicated. Every country has different rules, different forms of transport, different cityscapes, and to build a mass-market autonomous vehicle requires adapting these systems to the rules for different countries.
So, how far off is this future when cars can drive without anyone at the wheel? It's not happening in 2020. It's happening today.
Welcome to Moonshot, the show exploring the world's biggest ideas and the people making them happen. I'm Christopher Lawson, and today on the show we're exploring the world of self-driving cars to see what actually needs to happen for us to realize this dream of a driverless city. And just a disclaimer, one of the companies that we'll talk about in this episode is Uber, a company that my co-host Andrew Moon actually works for. So for that reason, he's going to sit this one out.
Flip a switch and suddenly everyone's car is self-driving. There's going to be a period of time, decades worth of time, where there's going to be this overlap period where there will be a small number of self-driving cars and still the majority of cars in the world will be manually operated.
This is Andrew Hawkins. He's the transportation reporter for The Verge.
The way into this autonomy, this full autonomy, is people buying newer cars that have these semi-autonomous features, and then sort of on a parallel track, using more ride-hailing and ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, maybe realizing that they don't need to own a car. Maybe they can rely on some of these services, maybe rely on some of the car-sharing services like Car2Go and Zipcar. And if these things sort of on a parallel track will eventually start to converge, and we'll start to see people using these autonomous transportation services, and then things will really start to kick into gear.
Andrew is someone who is on the forefront of reporting on autonomous vehicles. And as he just alluded to, there's a ton of companies playing in the self-driving space right now. And we will dive deeper into those companies in a later episode, I promise. But the focus for this episode is on building a driverless city. And one company that I did want to mention is Uber. Because when you think about the potential impact driverless cars will have on society, you can't help but think about a world where you don't need to own your own car. You just book a car and it turns up and takes you to your destination. And in that world, the car is seen almost like a form of public transport. And it's something which with Uber, you can kind of already access. Although one day, those Uber drivers, well, they won't exist. Your cars will be autonomous.
Our interest is in building a global ride-sharing network. It's not necessarily to manufacture cars one way or the other, autonomous or otherwise.
That's the current Uber CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, talking at the New York Times DealBook conference in early November.
At the same time, we want to make sure that we have availability to autonomy as it comes into the market. And right now, with the technology being as young, there are certain players who are interested in developing autonomy and operating a network, and there are certain players who just want to manufacture. So our investment in autonomy is one, in that we think it's a really, really interesting space that is worth a ton of money, and there's a lot of capital going in.
Now, Uber's heavy investment in autonomous vehicles won't result in real-world usage for a number of years yet. Building autonomous vehicles is hard, and it's very easy for things to go wrong, something which you don't want if you're running a network of autonomous vehicles.
Because the issue with autonomy in any software is that you've got these edge cases. With autonomy, the edge cases kill you, right? So you've got to actually build out for all the edge cases, which makes it a very, very difficult problem to solve.
But that hasn't stopped Uber from thinking about how such a system could work. And like Andrew Hawkins mentioned earlier in the show, there's not going to be some switch where everything just switches to autonomous. There'll be some kind of transition period. And I've heard a number of people mention different figures as to how long that period will take. I've heard everything from 5 years to 20 years. But one thing's for sure, it will take time.
It's not going to go from 0 to 1. There are going to be hybrid networks.
I think particularly with Google and /Waymo, and also with other companies that have been piloting some of the public experiments with self-driving cars. It's that they've remained still sort of behind, sort of a barbed wire fence, to use a metaphor, in terms of like accessibility. So that you can count maybe on two hands the number of people who've actually ridden in these things. And it's not until we get more people into them that you're going to actually start to see the commercialization start to sort of spring into action.
Will you be buying one?
See, that's the thing. I don't think that these self-driving cars are meant to be purchased by people. I think that this is supposed to signal the end of personal car ownership. These are meant to be taken out and used as a taxi service in a sharing capacity. On top of that, they'll probably be too expensive to own. The equipment that's attached to them, while is getting cheaper and cheaper to produce, a lot of the sensors, the LiDAR sensors and the radars that are attached to these cars, it'll still be a level of cost that most people will not be willing to bear for themselves. They want mass market cars. Those are the cars, the sort of the $20,000 to $40,000 range in the U.S. are the cars that most people buy. And I don't think people will be buying autonomous vehicles unless you're, LeBron James or someone who can afford that type of vehicle.
Do you think that will be a generational change, that it needs a new generation of people to really adopt that technology?
Absolutely, 100%. It's if you look at a lot of surveys involving millennials, most of those people are less inclined to want to own their own car. They want to live in cities. They don't want to be tethered down to sort of the hassles and the obligations and the responsibilities that come with car ownership. They want to use Uber. They want to use Lyft to get around, or public transportation. There needs to be, commensurate with the development of autonomous vehicles as a service, as a transportation service, there also needs to be more investment in public transportation to make sure that that people have options. If they don't have options, then people will continue to purchase vehicles. And if we want to move to a system where nobody owns these vehicles, they're managed as fleets, much like a city would manage a fleet of buses, or a taxi service would manage a fleet of taxis, then there needs to be commensurate infrastructure investments in public transportation. But that said, I do think that it is a generational shift. That it will be the younger generation, the kids that are teenagers and 20-year-olds that are right now, who are getting driver's licenses at a much slower rate than the previous generation, that will sort of be the deciders in terms of how are these vehicles going to be used. Will they be owned or will they be shared?
And we'll be looking deeper at the impact these vehicles will have on our cities right after this break. Now, before the break, we were looking at autonomous vehicles and the potential for these vehicles to be turned into a self-driving fleet, which could act as a form of public transport. One day you'll call an Uber and a self-driving vehicle will turn up and take you directly to your destination, quickly and efficiently. And with the implementation of these mass transit ideas for autonomous systems will come a lot of questions over what becomes of our roads. So I went over to the University of Melbourne to speak to someone who is researching the impact autonomous vehicles will have on the way we design our cities.
Well, I can imagine an autonomous vehicle operating on our freeways. There's trials across the world where people can run these things on freeways. Where I think we have a huge challenge is on suburban streets, urban streets. Just imagine your local shopping street, Sydney Road, Chapel Street, wherever that might be. And imagine a car which is never going to hit a pedestrian or a cyclist. If you're a pedestrian or a cyclist and that balance of fear is changed, why wouldn't you just walk out into the street? And then why wouldn't the next person walk out into the street? So how is this car actually ever going to get along a busy suburban street?
This is Dr. John Stone. He's a senior lecturer in transport planning and urban planning at the University of Melbourne. And he spent a lot of time researching how autonomous vehicles will impact our cities and how our cities need to adapt to make the most of the technology.
One of the things that transport planners have done successfully over the last 15, 20 years, particularly in Europe, but in other places in Australia as well, is to mix pedestrians, public transport, cars, and that in a way of slowing things down, making things more human. So if you take the CBD of Melbourne as an example, what transport planners have been working on for years is to try and get private vehicle mobility out of that mix, because it just isn't the best use of the space. So we've encouraged people to get public transport to the city, to ride, to walk when they get around the city. So really I think it could be quite sensible to think that just because it's autonomous doesn't make it any better in that sort of mix. So perhaps we would not want to have autonomous vehicles in those dense urban cores. So we have to think about where would the drop-off points be, how would they interact with the public transport system.
Now, Dr. Stone says there's a number of key things that transport planners are examining when it comes to autonomous vehicles. One is the safety aspect. Two is the way these vehicles interact with existing mass transit systems, and also the impact the vehicles could have on urban sprawl. But I was really keen to know what might become of the basics, like the roads and the traffic lights that we already have, because while these vehicles are autonomous and they're designed to run on our existing road infrastructure, potentially they don't need all that.
That's one of the things, the idea that we don't need traffic lights is one of the things that might, full autonomy might get us. But it really, that's if you're optimizing the movement of the autonomous vehicle, not if you're managing its interaction with pedestrians and cyclists. And that's, I think, in the technology terms, is going to be the hardest thing, because so much of what makes a system work between people in their cars and people on foot is the eye contact that is made. Just with a move of your eyebrow, a driver can say, it's okay if you walk in front of me, and a machine isn't going to be able to do that unless they're much, much more sophisticated than they are at the moment.
When these car designers or bus designers are designing these autonomous vehicles, should they be designing systems that behave in those same ways, or should they be designing systems that are completely different? And should the autonomous vehicles behave differently because they are inherently different? Should we be trying to replicate, human intelligence through these and human courtesy through these autonomous vehicles when they interact with the city space?
Well, it's the human courtesy and the human interaction that makes it possible for us to interact in in really dense, complex urban environments. So if we're going to introduce this new technology and we're not going to force us to have more space given over to vehicles, really what we want to do in city spaces is create places for interaction. That's what's valuable about a dense urban environment. And if we damage that, we risk what makes cities great. And that's why I'm really concerned that we have to be saying, unless these technologies enhance our interactions in city space, then they don't really have a place there.
Now, when we look at autonomous vehicles and the different approaches to the technology, there's kind of two streams of thought. There's the idea that you as an individual, will one day own an autonomous car. But then the other thought is that actually nobody will own a car and we'll just book them like we book an Uber at the moment. So I asked Dr. John Stone about these different approaches and which would be best for our cities.
Well, that's the million-dollar question, really. But I think what is coming down the pipe and where the investment is that companies like Google, Uber will have fleets of these vehicles which we will share. I mean, the extent to which people will choose to share a vehicle for their daily travel needs is something that culturally is going to be a challenge for us. How that will play out and how it will play out against the sense that people have of my car is my space, I've got my gym gear there, I've got my dog there, I've got, all this stuff that's there for me for my whole day, and sometimes it's the only time I get to be on my own. All these cultural reasons why we use a car will be changed by that sort of shared economy. So it's a really, really complex question, and I don't know the answers yet.
What happens in regards to something like, we see peak hour traffic in many cities across the globe, and how will autonomous vehicles solve problems like that? And will the autonomous nature of the vehicles and the fact that they're electric and don't make much noise, will that then enable them to find other routes to their destinations and, make use of other roads that they currently don't?
One of the things that's interesting in all of the modelling, a lot of the sort of benefits come when you have full shared economy and full autonomy of the whole fleet. And then when you model that, you find you do save a lot of vehicle kilometres and so on. So that transitional phase is going to be very, very complex. The interesting question that you raise about will we be using our road space differently, and will we, one of the things that we've done, particularly through citizens sort of revolts in the 70s and 80s, is to have traffic calming, have closures of streets, and force the noisy traffic onto the arterial roads, which is pretty tough if you happen to live on the arterial road. But at least some people in the city get protected from the noise and the danger. So do we have these cars sort of encouraged to use all sorts of different routes? What are they really that they will be a bit quieter, but what does it mean for an urban space, a suburban street with a lot more cars in it, or do we want to use that suburban street for other things, narrower streets, greener spaces, place for, using that as play space, as people have often advocated for. So yeah, that's a really interesting question that are we opening ourselves up for new sort of traffic calming debates? And my fear is that these things won't reduce vehicle travel because we'll find new uses for vehicles. So we can't yet imagine how these things will shape our lives, but when we have a new technology, we tend to want to use it in all sorts of new and different ways. And so, my sense is that however we think about these things, we're going to have to think about there'll be potentially more traffic on the roads.
So let's assume that we are going to live in a world where our roads look and feel completely different, and fleets of self-driving vehicles run by Uber and Waymo will be passing by every second. But with so many software and car companies exploring self-driving technology, how do we actually keep a consistent standard with how these systems operate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question.
This is Andrew Hawkins again.
Up until recently, just in terms of regular manually driven cars, obviously each car has its own take on cruise control and different safety features, but they're also subject to regulation and to government regulators come in and saying this doesn't meet our standards of safety, and so that needs to be recalled or that needs to be tweaked and changed and improved upon. And then that's why I think that it's really sort of incumbent upon on government, on elected officials, on elected bodies to come up with with a set of rules and regulations that doesn't discourage innovation and doesn't discourage these companies from rolling out some of these features and making sure that they have enough runway space to test them out, but at the same time ensures that anything that is available to the public and is sold in a commercial perspective is safe and meets the public's standards for safety. You've got Tesla, they've already put out autopilot. They seem to sort of found a bit of a blind spot for regulators, because regulators don't have standards in place for things like over-the-air software updates, which Tesla really has been sort of at the forefront of, and a lot of the other OEMs have had to sort of play catch-up in that respect. But at the same time, you have incidents like there was the Tesla owner who was killed in Florida while his Tesla was in autopilot. There was a big deal made about that, and that's because it was a very sad thing that happened that this man died, but at the same time, it is a really big deal to sort of try to figure out why it was that this accident happened and to ensure that that standards are in place to make sure that it doesn't happen again, because people are going to be hyper aware and hyper cognizant of any accidents or fatalities that occur in autonomous vehicles, and there will be others.
While there are some risks to blindly rolling out autonomous systems, it's very clear that everyone wants to get this right, because the advantages of having a perfectly operating autonomous car network would be significant. But until we get to the point of having full autonomy, it's important that we talk about the technology and educate people on the momentous shift that's about to happen. And Dr. John Stone says there's a number of issues that the public needs to discuss to prepare for this future.
What are the things that we don't like about our current dependence on our car? What are the things that we lose from being so dependent on private motor vehicles? And how are we going to make sure that those sort of ambitions, those sort of ideas for our cities are actually fostered by this new technology? So that's something where I think we really are very slow to engage with, because most people don't yet see the real problems with car driving, let alone new technologies. So we don't want to be in the situation where we're going, oh, wish we'd thought about this a bit more, and wish we hadn't built all those freeways, and wish we had built public transport. So, and we have to make sure that we're not in the same position in 10 or 15 years with autonomous vehicles.
And that's everything we have for Moonshot for 2017. Thanks to all of you, our listeners, for supporting the show this year. And thanks to everyone who completed the listener survey and gave us suggestions on how to improve the show. We're taking some time off over Christmas to spend time with our families and plan some more content. But we'll be back early next year with more episodes. And if you've got a moonshot that you'd love us to explore or a guest you want to see on the show, just send us an email to moonshot@lawson.media. Moonshot is a production of Lawson Media, and it's hosted by me, Christopher Lawson, and also Andrew Moon. Our amazing theme music is by Breakmaster Cylinder, and our cover artwork is by Andrew Millist. Make sure you track us down on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for Moonshot Pod. And check out our website, moonshot.audio. Join us again soon on Moonshot as we explore more ideas that are set to change your future.